Boston, October 2013, Berklee College of Music. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were sitting in the back row of a lecture hall, and a 34-year-old music theory professor was explaining to his students why the musicians who built rock and roll didn't really know what they were doing. Neither of them said anything. Not yet. The students in the front rows had no idea who was behind them. The professor had no idea either. He had a lot of ground to cover and a PowerPoint that wasn't going to present itself. He kept going. 20 minutes later, Keith Richards was going to pick up a guitar that wasn't his, play 4 bars, and reduce the room to silence. But before that happened, the professor was going to say something very specific about a riff that Keith had written in a bathroom in Clearwater, Florida in 1965. And he was going to be wrong about it in a way that only one person in the world could correct. That person was sitting 7 rows behind him. He was wearing a dark jacket with rings on every finger and had a cigarette behind his ear that he had been pretending for 2 hours he wasn't going to smoke. The event was Berklee's annual Distinguished Visitors Series, a week of lectures, workshops, and masterclasses built around invited industry figures. Mick and Keith had been asked to accept honorary fellowships and give a brief address to the student body the following morning. They had arrived a day early, checked into their hotels separately, and on Tuesday afternoon had done what both of them occasionally did in cities where nobody was expecting them. They went somewhere and sat down and listened. The lecture hall held 200 seats. The Tuesday afternoon session on contemporary music theory and popular tradition was not the kind of class that filled rooms. 60 students, mostly sophomores, in the front 2/3 of the hall, laptops open, coffee cups in various states of abandonment. 3 students in the 4th row had already stopped taking notes and were watching a video with one earbud in. The professor at the front was named Dr. Aaron Cole, young for his position, 34, a doctorate from Juilliard, 2 published papers on harmonic analysis in post-war American popular music, and the specific self-assurance of someone who had spent his entire professional life in rooms where his credentials were the most impressive thing present. He was good at what he did. That was the problem. He was good enough to be certain. The foundational misunderstanding about rock music, Cole said, clicking to his next slide, a waveform analysis of a distorted guitar, is that its practitioners were making deliberate harmonic choices. They were not. They were responding to feel, to what sounded right in the room. The theory was arrived at accidentally. The blues scale, the pentatonic, the I4-Fi progression, these were inherited structures that the musicians of the 60s and 70s used without fully understanding why they worked. He clicked again. This is not a criticism. This is the music's origin story, but it matters when we talk about craft versus instinct. The musicians who defined that era were extraordinary interpreters. They were not, in any academic sense, composers. In the 7th row from the back, a hand found a pen. Keith Richards had been slouched in his seat for 40 minutes with his dark jacket pushed up around his collar and his eyes half closed in a way that could have meant sleep but didn't. He had been listening the way Keith Richards listened to things. Not reacting, just receiving, storing, deciding later whether anything needed to be done about it. He opened the notepad he had brought out of hotel room habit. He began to write something. Notes, not words. Actual notation. Chord symbols, intervals. A progression sketched in 3 lines. The student sitting next to him glanced over at the notation. Standard chord symbols, but the way they were written, the shorthand, the speed of them, suggested a hand that had been doing this since before the student was born. He looked at the man's hands, the rings, the particular texture of those hands, the skin of them, the history in them. He looked at the man's face. He looked back at the front of the room. He looked back at the man's face. His mouth opened slightly. He looked at the man's hands again. He did not say anything because his brain was taking slightly longer than usual to process what his eyes were already certain about. Next to Keith, Mick was sitting with his arms loosely crossed, his deep purple chiffon shirt open at the chest, silver gray hair loose. No jacket over the shirt. No hat. He looked the way Mick Jagger looks when he is being invisible, which is to say he was not entirely succeeding. But the room was full of people who weren't expecting to see him there, and the human brain is very good at not seeing what it isn't looking for. Dr. Cole moved to his next point. Harmonic analysis of specific recordings. This was where he was most comfortable. This was where the papers lived. Take, as an example, the guitar riff from Satisfaction, 1965. One of the most recognizable figures in rock history. A news slide. The riff transcribed in standard notation, the intervals labeled. Harmonically, this is extraordinarily simple. The entire riff operates within a single scale. There are no borrowed chords, no chromatic movement, no theoretical complexity whatsoever. It is essentially a mistake that became iconic. A fuzz pedal was used to replicate a horn section that couldn't be booked for the session, and what was intended as a placeholder demo became the record. The genius is in the accident, not in any compositional intent. Keith's pen stopped. He looked at the slide. He looked at Mick. Mick looked back at him. The expression on Mick's face was not quite a smile. It was the face of a man who knows exactly what is coming and is not going to stop it. Keith looked back at the slide for a long moment. Then he wrote one more line in the notepad, underlined it, closed it, and sat forward in his seat for the first time all afternoon. Before we hear what Keith Richards says to a room full of music students who have no idea who he is, drop a comment if you've ever watched someone get the facts wrong about something you actually built. And stay with us, because what happens in the next 4 minutes is the reason this lecture hall was still being talked about 5 years later. The fuzz pedal wasn't an accident, Keith said. His voice carried without effort. It was not loud. It was the voice of a man who has filled stadiums and understands that volume is the least interesting dimension of sound. Dr. Cole stopped. He turned from the slide. He looked at the back of the room. He saw a man in a dark jacket sitting forward in his seat with a notepad open and a pen in his hand and rings on every finger. "I'm sorry," Cole said. "The fuzz pedal," Keith said. "It wasn't a placeholder for horns. We knew what we wanted. The fuzz was the point. The tone was the composition. You can't separate the sound from the riff and then call it simple. That's like saying a painting is just shapes because you've removed the color." He paused. The riff was written to live in that sound. Take the sound away and you've got something different. Put it back and you've got the record. Cole looked at him. The credentials were assembling themselves into a rebuttal. "With respect," Cole said, keeping the tone even. "The historical record shows the fuzz tone was a result of a malfunctioning—" "I was there," Keith said. The room went quiet in a way that lecture hall rooms do not usually go quiet. Cole's rebuttal stopped somewhere in his chest. "I was in the studio," Keith said. "I wrote the riff. I chose the pedal. It wasn't a malfunction. It was the first time I'd used that particular fuzz box and I knew within 4 bars what we had." He leaned back in his chair. "You might want to update the slide." The student who had looked at Keith's hands earlier had now fully arrived at the conclusion his brain had been approaching for 20 minutes. He was staring. 2 students near him followed his eye line. The word moved through the row in whispers. First a question, then a certainty. Dr. Cole was looking at the man in the dark jacket. The rings, the face, the particular economy of movement, the cigarette behind the ear. Cole's hands, which had been on the edges of his lectern, came off it. He started. "Yeah," Keith said. Mick, in the seat beside him, had not moved. He was watching Cole with that same expression. Not quite a smile, not quite anything else. The specific look of a man who has spent 50 years watching rooms figure out who he is and has made a kind of peace with the delay. Cole looked at Mick. The process began again, faster this time. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He was 34 years old, Juilliard educated, published twice, and he had just told Keith Richards that Keith Richards didn't know what he was doing when he wrote Satisfaction. "I owe you an apology," Cole said. His voice had lost its lectern quality. "No, you don't," Keith said. "You owe the riff one." He stood up. He was slightly stiffer than he used to be and made no attempt to disguise it. "You got a guitar up here." Cole gestured toward the corner. A Fender Telecaster on a stand, the department's demo instrument used for in-class illustrations. Keith walked down the aisle, unhurried. He picked up the Telecaster, checked the tuning by ear in 8 seconds, adjusted 2 strings, plugged it into the small practice amp in the corner, and turned the volume to 4. Not loud, just enough. He stood in front of 60 students and a professor who had stopped being a professor and started being an audience. Now here is what nobody who writes about music theory prepared those students for. They knew what the satisfaction riff sounded like. They had heard it 10,000 times. They had analyzed its intervals, labeled its scale, written about it in the exact terms Dr. Cole had just used. They knew it the way you know a word you've read so many times it stops looking like a word. What they did not know was what it sounds like when the man who wrote it plays it. In a room this size, without a PA, without production, without anything between the string and the air, Keith played the riff. 4 bars. He didn't perform it. He didn't demonstrate it. He played it the way you play something you've played every day for 50 years and never got tired of because you still haven't found the bottom of it. The room held its breath. Then Keith bent the last note in a way that wasn't on any transcription, that wasn't in any waveform analysis, that wasn't on Cole's slide, a half-step inflection that lasted less than a second and contained inside it the entire argument about craft versus instinct that Cole had spent 40 minutes making. He set the guitar back on the stand. "That part," Keith said, nodding toward where the bend had been. "That wasn't an accident either. 60 students in a Boston lecture hall on a Tuesday afternoon were doing something students in lecture halls rarely do spontaneously. They were on their feet." Mick was still in the back row. He was clapping, slowly, with the slightly amused expression of a man watching something he had seen many variations of across 50 years of shared stages. Dr. Cole stood at his lectern. He looked at the now empty guitar stand. He looked at Keith, who was walking back up the aisle with the same unhurried quality with which he had come down it. Cole was not a bad man. He was not even a bad teacher. He was a good teacher who had made the oldest mistake a good teacher can make. He had confused knowing about something with knowing it. "I'd like to revise my earlier point," Cole said, to the room rather than to anyone specifically. "About instinct versus craft." He looked at Keith. "Would you be willing to stay for the rest of the session?" Keith sat back down in his seat. He pulled the cigarette from behind his ear and looked at it. He put it back. "Sure," he said, "but you're going to have to throw out the PowerPoint." What happened in that lecture hall for the next 90 minutes was not a master class in the formal sense. There was no structure to it. Cole asked questions. Keith answered them, sometimes with words and sometimes with the guitar. Mick talked about the difference between performing a song and inhabiting it, about what it means to sing something you've been singing for 30 years and still mean it. Students who had been checking their phones were leaning forward with their laptops closed. At one point, a sophomore in the 3rd row asked Mick how you keep a song alive after you've played it 10,000 times. Mick thought about it for a moment. "You don't keep it alive," he said. "You let it be alive. The song knows what it is. Your job is to get out of the way." The student wrote that down. So did Cole. That evening, Keith and Mick had dinner alone in a small restaurant near the hotel. No reservations, corner table, the way they sometimes did in cities between obligations. The conversation moved the way 50 years of shared history moves, not in a straight line, but in spirals, landing on old things from new angles. At some point the food arrived and they ate without discussing it, and Keith poured wine without asking, and at one point Keith looked at the breadbasket and said, "He wasn't entirely wrong, you know." Mick looked at him. "About instinct," Keith said. "That's mostly what it was. The theory came later." He picked up the bread. "But so what? The theory was in the sound before anyone named it. That's where theory comes from anyway." He paused. He just had the direction wrong. The following morning they received their honorary fellowships. Dr. Cole was in the audience. When Mick spoke briefly at the ceremony, he said one thing that Cole would quote in his papers for the next decade. "Music theory is the map. The music is the territory. Don't confuse them." Cole never made that particular mistake in a lecture again. "We'll leave you with something Keith Richards once said. From an interview or a stage or a tour bus somewhere across 5 decades of making the map and ignoring it equally. Music is a language that doesn't speak in particular words. It speaks in emotions. If this story reminded you that what you built always knows more than what someone else can say about it, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Another legend story is waiting for you right now. See you in the next one.